Look at that wreck of a truck. I swear it's in better shape than your face. And your miserable life, you piece of junk, Jason Kruger. The rookie cop, barely out of adolescence who had already learned the art of contempt, stood in the middle of the street, shouting into the face of an old veteran. In his mind, life was only made of winners and washed-up losers. Yet that rotten brain of his was too dim to realize the man before him had once raised a nightmare, the commander of the Delta Force, the deadliest strike unit in America, and now that nightmare was headed straight for this town. In your state, do trash like this still have a place to live? Which state are you from? The old Ford Ranger, its body patched with peeling paint and dust, as stubborn as old war memories, rumbled slowly down a sun-drenched suburban road. Inside the cabin, Robert McCall, clad in a faded shirt and a worn-out cap, embroidered with a battered parachute unit insignia, stared straight ahead, his wrinkled but steady hands gripping the wheel. This town had changed too much since he last marched down its silent streets, but a soldier's memories, like old scars, never faded, only deepened. He didn't need the rearview mirror to know he was being tailed. A harsh siren tore through the quiet like a slap in the face. "Pull over, old man." Robert steered to the curb, the motion so practiced it seemed more reflex from dodging mortar shells than avoiding insults hurled by uniformed men who didn't understand the uniform they wore. His face remained as cold as an old stone battered by wind. Only his fingers whitening against the steering wheel betrayed his tension. The police car door swung open with unnecessary force and out stepped Jason Kruger, swaggering, wearing dark sunglasses that hid half his face but failed to mask the sneer curling at the edges of his mouth. He strutted toward the battered truck as if claiming a cheap trophy. Kruger tapped his baton against his palm, his voice slicing through the air. "Trash like this isn't allowed to drive in my town." He emphasized my town the way a conqueror would claim new land, not as a civil servant paid by taxpayers. Robert did not react. He slowly rolled down the window with the old manual crank, each movement stiff and deliberate, mirroring the heavy beats of his heart. His breath drifted through the narrow opening, heavy and slow. Jason leaned down, his face close to the window, his breath reeking of cigarette smoke and disdain. "Where are your papers, Grandpa?" Robert slowly reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out a bundle of documents, so worn they seemed to carry the stains of sweat and time itself. Jason snatched them without hiding his disgust, flipping the registration papers as if handling crumpled toilet paper. "What a pile of junk," Jason sneered, tossing them back through the window. The papers struck the steering wheel and fell to the floor. Kruger narrowed his eyes, studying Robert like a predator bored with weak prey. "Where are you taking this rolling trash heap? Heading to a nursing home? Shopping for your own grave?" Every word he spat was sharpened with malice, laced with the sick pleasure of seeing no resistance. But Robert McCall did not flinch. His face was carved in cold stone, unmoving, unyielding, offering neither anger nor justification. Jason growled, annoyed that the silence robbed him of an excuse to escalate out of the vehicle. "Inspection." Robert unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements slow, drained by time like an old machine. As he opened the door and stepped out, the weight of his years showed in how he braced against the truck for balance. Jason didn't wait a second. He shoved Robert hard in the chest, a shove that was unnecessary, a shove fueled only by cheap power. Robert stumbled to his knees onto the rough asphalt, the impact silent but jarring, like a strangled gasp in the chest of anyone who might have witnessed it. The cap fell from Robert's head, tumbling near Jason's feet. Alongside it, a small object, an old military badge, tarnished and warped by time, but still bearing the eagle clutching a spear, the emblem of the United States Airborne Brigade. Jason glanced down, scooping the badge with the toe of his boot like picking up street litter. He snorted, his voice as sharp as a razor. "This thing? Decoration for your trash heap?" Robert slowly pushed himself upright without looking at Jason, without replying. His eyes locked onto the badge lying beneath Jason's boot, not with rage, not with screams, but with a silent agony so profound it could shame anyone with a soul. Jason, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, casually kicked the badge toward the dusty roadside. In the careless sweep, Robert's car keys were sent flying, landing deep into a dark, narrow storm drain. "Consider it a lesson," Jason sneered. "Walking's good for you, old man." Robert's face remained unchanged. He bent down, picked up his cap, and brushed the dust from the badge with a trembling fingertip. The thick calluses on his fingers, the legacy of years gripping a rifle in foreign jungles, were powerless now against the cold humiliation he suffered on his own soil. Jason turned away without a backward glance. In that moment, he missed something crucial. Not everyone was a weak civilian. Not everyone was a shadow he could stomp on without consequence. And not everyone who stayed silent had surrendered. Robert placed his cap back on his head, adjusting the brim with the precise ritual of a soldier preparing for battle. He didn't watch the police cruiser speed away. He stood alone, beneath the searing sun and the buzzing of insects, like a mute statue, like a brewing thunderstorm hidden under thick clouds. The Ford Ranger sat idle, its doors flung open, as if it too were gasping for breath with its owner. On the passenger's seat, a flipped-over medical card revealed faint words: veteran, emergency, priority. No one saw it, no one cared. Only the cracked, burning asphalt bore silent witness to everything. The scuff marks from the kicked badge, the skid of the worn cap, and the figure of a man, one who would kneel before humiliation nor need to shout to affirm his dignity. The scorching midday sun poured down onto the pavement like invisible blades, searing every wrinkled crack on the faded concrete. Robert McCall placed his worn cap back on his head, his hand tightly clutching the dusty insignia in his palm, like the last soldier standing amidst the ruins of a fallen trench. He walked toward the battered Ranger, barely breathing under the heat, his gaze no longer on the retreating back of the cop, but silently resting on the stained patch of earth where he had just fallen. No words were needed. Humiliation had already carved its mark there, a wound that did not bleed, cut deep into the bone. Robert slowly opened the truck door, his body stiffening as he forced himself into the driver's seat, the dull ache from the unexpected shove beginning to torment every old joint. But he did not groan, did not utter a complaint. In war, men like him had learned to wrap their pain deep inside like bullets lodged in flesh, left to fester without being extracted. Then, as if part of a cruelly scripted joke, from the far end of the street, Jason Kruger swung his car around, tires screeching across the melting asphalt. The black and white Crown Vic slid closer, headlights blazing unnaturally bright, as if the light itself had been forced to play along with his brutal charade. Jason stepped out, this time not rushing. He walked slowly, his black shoes pounding the street like victory drums announcing the conquest of a worthless pride. He bent low by Robert's window, sneering. "Not done yet, Grandpa. This piece of junk needs a deeper inspection. Who knows what illegal crap you might be hiding in there?" The words, seemingly a joke, were delivered in a voice so chilling that passers-by hesitated under the searing heat. Robert did not move. He unlocked the door, pulled the seat lever, exposing the back compartment for Jason to rummage through. No one spoke, but the whole town seemed to hold its breath as Jason plunged his hands inside, tearing through everything. A tool bag, an old water jug, a faded field jacket, a tattered leather-bound Bible. Jason threw each item onto the ground with shameless irritation, every toss like an invisible slap against the past that Robert carried with him. When Jason yanked out a rusty tin box, he chuckled dryly. "Well, what do we have here? Grandpa's medal collection?" Without waiting, he pried the box open with his baton, sending a cascade of tarnished medals flying onto the ground. Bronze Star medals, combat awards, unit badges. They scattered across the sunlit street. Some of the bystanders fell silent, not because they did not see, but because a chill crawled up their spines as they realized that what was being desecrated were not just objects. They were blood, life, and pride cast into metal, now tossed away like trash. Jason snickered, kicking the medals farther with each deliberate nudge, each kick a gleeful release of some nameless anger toward a past he neither understood nor cared to. You think wearing these tin cans on your chest means people should bow down to you?" he barked, his face cold, a glint of cruel triumph flashing in his eyes, before snapping, "Here, I am the law, and you're just trash." A middle-aged man nearby clenched his fists deep inside his pockets, veins bulging under his sun-darkened skin. But he did not step forward. No one did. They only watched. The look of people who knew stepping out would only drag them into the same pit of shame with no way out. Robert bent down, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from physical pain, as he picked up each medal, each button, each scattered fragment of memory. Every time his fingers touched the burning metal, it was as if he were reclaiming the lives of fallen brothers from distant battlefields. Not a single word left his lips. Not a single glance was spared for Jason. That silence, thick, heavy silence, was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of a mountain standing firm against a storm. No need to fight, only to endure. Jason seemed to feel that stubbornness like an invisible slap across his own face. He backed off, kicking a dust cloud into the air, then pointed a finger at Robert and snarled, "I'll make sure you never drive another mile in this town again, you old leech, you parasite." Robert gathered the remnants, carefully placing them back into the rusty tin box, tying it shut with an old frayed string. For the first time, he looked directly at Jason, a gaze as frozen as a winter lake, devoid of anger or pleading, simply delivering a wordless statement, "You have trampled on something you do not understand, and you will pay for it." Kruger shifted uncomfortably but turned away, running his hand through his sweat-drenched blonde hair, waving lazily at the silent crowd. "Move along, just a routine check," he barked, the sarcasm in his voice tinged with a nervous edge he could not hide. Robert stood up, straight, his back no longer bowed under the weight of age. His small shadow stretched long over the cracked pavement, as resilient as the days when he carried a rucksack, a rifle, and the burdens of a generation that never demanded anyone understand their pain. No one stepped forward to help. No hands reached out to steady him. But the way people looked at Robert as he trudged heavily back to his truck, clutching the tin box against his chest, had changed. No longer was it the pitying gaze reserved for a doddering old man. No longer the averted glance given to a has-been. It was a shame, a deep, sinking shame, like thick mud seeping straight into the heart. And under that blistering noonday sun, as the battered ranger's wheels squealed and rolled away slowly, Jason Kruger stood by the roadside, lighting a cigarette, his eyes narrowing as he watched the diminishing silhouette of the dilapidated truck. A smug smile curled on his lips, a smile of someone who believed he had scored a cheap, easy victory. He had no idea that at that very moment, deep within the town's heart, a silent fire had been lit, a fire that would need no shouting, no smashing, but would be enough to burn down the fragile illusions he so foolishly thought made him untouchable. The heat still hammered down on the pavement like relentless hammers, yet no one could hear the cicadas buzzing or feel the heat radiating from the melting asphalt anymore. The space around the dilapidated gas station seemed frozen in a thick silence, a kind of silence heavier than screams, enveloping those who stood and watched. Robert McCall's battered Ranger creaked slowly out of the lot, leaving behind it a trail of eyes of every kind, fixed upon it. Jason Kruger still stood there, squinting after the retreating truck, a smug sneer lingering at the corner of his mouth. He lit a second cigarette, lazily leaning against the hood of his cruiser, as if he had just completed a textbook lesson on how to discipline someone deemed beneath him. The wind swept along the roadside, carrying the acrid smell of half-burnt tobacco mixed with dust and something far worse, the stench of cowardice and invisible complicity. Among the scattered crowd along the sidewalk, no one spoke a word. A middle-aged woman clutched a bag of groceries tightly against her chest, her eyes darting away like someone caught in the act of wrongdoing. An elderly couple, hand in hand, hurried in the opposite direction, their shoes crunching through the dust like footsteps fleeing from their own conscience. A mechanic in a faded blue jumpsuit, hands still stained with grease, stood frozen beside the gas pump, his gaze locked on the fresh scratches gouged into Robert's truck, as if they were gashes into a pride he had long since abandoned. On a rotting wooden bench under the old oak tree, an elderly man with white hair and a veteran's cap clutched his cane with trembling hands, squeezing it as if it were the last shred of courage he could hold on to. His eyes never left the faint trail of dust left by the ranger, but his lips remained tightly sealed, unable to form words. Those eyes that had once witnessed the fall of comrades in distant wars, now only reflected a bitter helplessness at the injustice unfolding on the very soil they had bled to protect. A little girl, about 8 years old, wearing a pink dress with frayed shoulders, tugged at her mother's hand and asked in a voice so pure it was cruel, "Mom, what did that man do wrong for that cop to push him down?" The mother jerked the girl's hand tighter, squeezing it so hard her small knuckles turned white, and hissed, "Be quiet." But she did not answer, not because she did not know, but because she could not face the truth, that sometimes, in a small town reeking of cheap pride, right and wrong were defined only by who held the badge and the baton. Not far away, near the convenience store, a young man with a backward baseball cap hastily filmed the last few seconds of Robert's lonely departure. His hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from bottled-up rage. Yet, instead of stepping forward, instead of shouting, he simply saved the video to his phone, as if preserving evidence for a court of conscience that might never be convened. Jason Kruger inhaled deeply, blowing out a thin stream of smoke, his gaze sweeping around with disdain. He saw it all: the fear, the passivity, and most importantly, the silence. This crowd, whether white or of color, shared one thing in common. They did not dare confront him. They did not dare expose the false authority he draped over himself. He smiled coldly, spat onto the pavement, then ground the cigarette butt beneath his boot. "See that?" he muttered to himself, like savoring a reward. "They're all brave behind my back, but when faced, they tuck tails and run like rabid dogs." He turned away, strolling leisurely toward his patrol car, the swagger of someone who believed he was untouchable. But he did not know, nor did he care, that some wounds, though silent, only fester and feed a far greater storm the longer they are ignored. Far across the lot, on the supermarket steps, the young woman earlier quietly slipped her phone from her sleeve and uploaded the video to a local social media group with a short, choked caption, "Who is he? Why did we let this happen? And no one said anything." The phone vibrated non-stop as comments poured in. A veteran wrote, "Where did this happen? I want to know." A young mother asked, "Is this the America we're raising our children to believe in?" A high school student posted, "If he's a veteran, we owe him an apology." Jason knew none of this. The small town, the one he thought he had in the palm of his hand, had just sprouted a seed of resistance. But like all fools drunk on their own power, he did not need to know. As far as he was concerned, as long as no one slammed fists on tables, as long as no one dared scream out loud today, he had won. And so, under the blazing sun that seemed to melt the earth itself, Jason Kruger climbed into his cruiser, cranked the air conditioning to full blast, and slammed the door, shutting out the entire outside world. He revved the engine, his tires grinding over the fading trail of dust, and sped off, leaving behind a sea of eyes, silent, bitter, and heavy with an unspoken vow. One day, this silence will end, and when that day comes, it will not arrive with screaming. It will come in a way that even the most confident tyrants will never see come. Jason Kruger's tires screeched under the midday sun, dragging a twisted trail of gray dust across the skin of the town like a crude scratch. But even as his car disappeared behind a row of crumbling buildings, the wound he left behind did not vanish with the summer breeze. It remained, smoldering, like a dull knife twisted into a place no one dared to touch. The pride of a community long accustomed to bowing their heads. Robert McCall kept driving his battered Ranger, his eyes squinting against the sunlight, but still sharp enough to see the faces that turned away. He needed no help, nor did he expect any. Every meter of road slipping beneath the tires was another blow from the past, colliding against the present, stirring up memories he thought he had long buried. At a deserted intersection, Robert pulled over by a dry, barren lot, where a derelict gas station stood abandoned amid the swirling dust. He turned off the engine and leaned back to reach into the rear seat. The faded tin box rolled gently with the vehicle's movement, making a lonely sound like the last sigh in a dying man's throat. Robert opened the box. Inside, amidst the jostled metals, lay an old photograph. A photograph that time and war had not managed to tear apart, but today had been stained by the filthy boots of a man who respected nothing but his own hollow ego. The photograph showed him, young, in a faded combat uniform, his eyes lifted with a tentative smile that still burned with pride. In his arms, a dark-skinned little boy, about 3 years old, clung to his neck, his bright black eyes gazing into the lens without fear, without doubt, only absolute trust. Using his fingertips, Robert gently brushed the dirt off the photograph. But some scratches, some small tears had already scarred its surface, like wounds that would never heal. He looked into the child's eyes, the same innocent, glowing eyes that once made him silently vow a promise he had never broken, to protect him at any cost. An engine roared behind him, yanking Robert out of his memories. Another patrol car crept closer. Jason Kruger again, still him, but this time he was not alone. In the passenger seat sat Deputy Rickman, a bloated man with squinting eyes and a crooked smile already etched on his face, a clear signal that what was about to happen would be even worse than before. Jason got out first, smirking at Robert like a predator gloating over a trapped, aging prey. He sauntered forward, gripping his baton like it was an extension of the twisted authority he had pinned to himself. Rickman chuckled darkly, pulling out his phone and raising it, ready to record their next achievement. "Oh, it's the troublesome old man again?" Jason said sweetly, his voice dripping like poisoned honey. "Didn't get enough last time? Or maybe you need a few more lessons about how things work around here." Robert said nothing. He folded the photograph, slipping it into the worn pocket of his shirt, his hand clenching so tightly the knuckles stood out stark against his sun-worn skin. In his eyes there was no explosive rage, no desperate cry like a younger man might unleash when humiliated, only a stillness, as steady as stone, the calm resilience of one who had seen too much death to waste breath on cheap insults. Jason snapped his fingers and Rickman moved to open Robert's truck door. Rummaging through it without a shred of cause, Jason reached into Robert's shirt pocket, snatching the photograph just tucked away. The photo fluttered from his fingers, landing on the dirty ground, scraping across a dusty patch of earth. "Well, well," Jason sneered, stooping to pick up the photograph, but instead of handing it back, he crumpled it into his palm, grinding his fingers into the thin paper as if to crush everything the man before him had ever held dear. An old soldier and a little kid. How touching. But you know what? Around here, family feelings don't buy you any law. Rickman cackled from behind him, a laugh steeped in cowardice and sycophancy. Robert stood still, his gaze locked on Jason, a gaze that did not shatter like the photograph, did not crumble like the worn insignia crushed under the boot. It was the gaze of a man who knew exactly what life had thrown at him and had already prepared to return it, not with haste, not with warning. Jason dropped the photograph to the ground, stomping on it with his polished boots. A slow, deliberate twist of his heel ground the memories into the dirt. Then he bent down and spat on the crumpled photo, saying, "Give it up, old man. There's no place left for dreamers like you in this world." Rickman clapped, like applauding a terrible comedy show. Jason laughed loudly, turning away, convinced he had taught yet another lesson. But what he didn't know, what he could never understand, was that some lessons did not need to be shouted. They only needed to be quietly sown, like seeds waiting to crack the hardest ground. Robert knelt down, picking up the torn photograph from the dirt. The fresh creases sliced across the child's face in the picture, like blades cutting into Robert's heart. He carefully smoothed the photo, tucking it back into the breast pocket of his shirt, near his heart. Not a word, not a plea. Only the quiet strength of a man who would not let his past be buried beneath the boots of the unworthy. The Ranger's engine rumbled back to life. Robert slid into the seat, fastening his seatbelt with slow, rigid movements, like a soldier securing his weapon before battle. No one among the thin, scattered crowd dared take their eyes off him. No one had the courage to step forward and help pick up the photograph. But every glance, a drop of shame compressed into silence, had already transformed into something else, a silent vow that they had borne witness, and some things once witnessed could never be forgotten. Robert McCall did not just carry with him invisible wounds. He also carried something beginning to ignite, not within himself, but within the eyes that had just witnessed him being trampled without daring to speak. The truck crept toward the old shopping plaza where a few struggling stores still clung to life through the recession. Robert stopped, turned off the engine, and sat quietly behind the wheel. He pulled out the crumpled photograph, smoothing it with a silent ritual, then tucked it back into his pocket. As he opened the door and stepped out, he could feel the stares pouring onto him from behind dusty window panes, from behind old store counters, from faded stone benches beneath withering trees. There were hesitant glances, as if people were holding a burning coal in their palms, too hot to hold, too frightening to throw away. Heads ducked quickly. Footsteps hurried past like fleeing winds, but Robert did not blame them. He understood that fear was not something that could be shattered by a single glance. It burrowed deep, like rotten roots beneath the earth, and only moved when the very ground itself gave way. And that, he knew, would not take long now. On the other side of town, in a small tin-roofed house, Carl Simmons, a veteran who had served in Kuwait, sat, slumped before his laptop screen. The silver-headed man, his sun-creased face and scarred hands shaped by years of carrying ammunition, watched the newly posted video on the local veterans group over and over again. The grainy footage began with Robert being shoved to the ground, the military insignia rolling away beneath the young cop's boots, followed by Jason Kruger's contemptuous kicks. Carl froze. The hands that had once steadied a sniper rifle 3 decades ago now trembled like leaves in the wind. For a moment, the blood-soaked memories of unnamed deaths surged through his mind, crushing his chest like a hammer to his soul. And right then, he knew he could not sit still. Carl grabbed his phone, dialing with shaking fingers. Tommy choked out as the line picked up, "You need to see this." Within an hour, dozens of copies of the video had spread across veteran groups throughout the state. Some shared it silently, without comment. Others typed brief, searing messages, each word cutting deep into the wall of indifference the town had built around itself long ago. Unbelievable. A veteran is treated like garbage on his own soil. How long do we let this happen? If we stay silent this time, we lose the right to ever hold our heads high again. Meanwhile, in a seedy bar near the highway, where middle-aged men gathered over warm beers and stories of their younger days, the usual chatter fell silent when one of them played the video on the big screen. Pale blue light illuminated weathered faces, eyes bloodshot with a rage ready to explode. A burly, bald man stood up, slamming his beer mug onto the table, sending liquid flying. "We're not letting this slide," he roared, his voice hoarse with fury. "Not after everything we sacrificed." Agreement rumbled through the cramped room like distant thunder. Some began texting, calling, their hands trembling not from age, but from the old fire reigniting in their veins. At a small cafe near the school, young mothers, part-time students, retirees, people who seemed to care only about bills and painkillers, watched the clip too. And as they saw Robert kneeling to retrieve his fallen badge, his hand trembling but his chin defiantly raised, something ignited inside them. Not pity, but shame at their own silence. No one said it out loud, but an invisible command swept through the room. Do not let this be forgotten. That afternoon, as the sunlight faded over the gray rooftops, subtle calls to action began to appear across the town's social media pages. Simple questions, without exclamation points or capital letters, yet more powerful than any slogan. Who is he? Who are we if we let this go? If today it's Robert McCall, who will it be tomorrow? At the police station, Jason Kruger lounged back in his chair, feet propped on the desk, a cold soda can pressed against his forehead. He snorted when Rickman showed him his phone screen, filled with notifications, shares, comments, outrage. Jason squinted at it, then let out a dry chuckle. Veterans? Hillbillies? He scoffed. Let 'em bark. When I crack down, who dares to look me in the eye? Rickman laughed along, a wet, cowardly sound of satisfaction. In Jason's world, as long as no one dared step into the streets, no one dared stand before him, every clip and every angry post was just the pathetic buzzing of flies trapped inside a wine bottle. He was wrong. As night fell, the silent fires within the once-mute hearts began to blaze. No one needed to scream. No one needed to slam fists on tables. They only needed to remember, and this time they would not forget. And somewhere on the western hills beyond town, inside a weather-beaten wooden house soaked with the smells of sweat and gunpowder, a young man stared at the video, replaying it dozens of times. His fists clenched until his knuckles whitened. His eyes did not blink, eyes that had never known defeat and never forgiven insult. Alexander McCall had received the silent invitation rising from the darkness, and this time he would answer. Night fell, and darkness wrapped around the town like a heavy blanket, pressing down on the worn-out houses and the cold, empty streets. In the small wooden house tucked at the edge of town, time seemed to stand still, coiling in the lingering scent of old sweat, leather, and gunpowder that had seeped into the grain of the wood over decades past. Robert McCall sat in a faded armchair, one hand resting on a cracked wooden armrest, the other limp on his thigh, his calloused fingers quietly tapping against his pants leg like a silent cadence to a ghostly march. Across the room, a faded American flag hung still, its creases crooked like the scars left by storms survived long ago. Beneath it stood an old picture frame, a photograph of a paratrooper unit from years past, youthful faces twisted into crooked smiles beneath steel helmets, arms locked over shoulders amidst a hell of bullets and burning sun. In the center of the room, a lopsided bookshelf sagged under the weight of worn tactical manuals and dog-eared volumes of military philosophy, silent witnesses to the life McCall had wrapped carefully into memories. Outside the window, the night wind whispered, carrying the dry scent of dust, wood, and the faint moisture from a small stream behind the house. But inside, the silence was so thick it seemed to groan under its own weight. Robert did not move. His whole body was like a solid block of stone. Only his eyes, deep and unflinching, gazing toward the tightly shut door, as if awaiting something that had been destined long ago. On the old wooden side table next to his chair, a battered flip phone lay still, like a weary relic from a bygone era. Robert reached for it, his movements neither hurried nor shaky, as if grasping an old M4 rifle in the darkness, waiting for a deployment order. His fingers glided lightly over the textured plastic, the tiny cracks on its surface blending into the texture of his own scarred skin. He flipped the phone open, the soft snap of the hinge cutting through the room, sharp and precise like the sound of a safety catch released. Robert did not scan through contacts. He did not search for a name. The number was embedded in his memory like a passcode to the gate of forgotten battlefields. He pressed each button slowly, precisely, every small beep echoing in the still room like the pounding of distant war drums. The phone rang, once, then a soft click. The line connected. Robert needed no introductions, no lead-ins, no explanations. Just one sentence, short, gravelly, solid as a boulder breaking free from a mountainside. Son, come here. It was not a request, it was not a plea, it was a summons, simple, absolute, as heavy as a verdict both men knew could not be refused. There was no reply on the other end. None was needed. That silence, thick with meaning, was heavier than any oath ever sworn. The silence between those who had once stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of life and death, who knew that a single glance, a single breath, was enough to understand each other's resolve. Robert lowered his hand, his palm brushing against the military badge pinned over his heart. The cold metal clung to his skin, a final reminder of promises that could never be erased. As he shifted slightly, the badge scraped against the worn fabric of his old shirt sleeve, a tiny sound that reverberated like the echo of a youth he was now calling back to life. No more words were needed. Robert snapped the phone shut. The sharp clack resounded through the room, cold and final as the pulling of a rifle bolt, ending the shortest but heaviest conversation of his life. Outside, the wind kept blowing, carrying the acrid scent of the late night and the weight of things yet to be named. But inside that small wooden house, among walls soaked with time and relics thick with memory, a decision had been made. A silent battle had been set into motion, without declarations, without drums, but one that would drown out all arrogance, all false pride, all empty illusions of power that men like Jason Kruger so foolishly clung to. Robert placed the phone back on the table. His eyes slowly closed, his face still and solemn like an old, weathered statue. No prayers, no fear, no hesitation. In his chest, the aged heart still beat out steady, solemn rhythms, like rifle shots echoing across distant fields of long-forgotten wars. He had called, and the one who needed to come would come. There was no doubt, no mercy left for those who had dared to trample on a warrior's pride. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind Alexander McCall with a deep, resounding thud, echoing through the military briefing room like a funeral bell sealing the end of all unfinished discussions. In that moment, no one dared to speak, no one dared to move. He was the son of McCall. He had just received the shortest order from his own father. And he knew, the shorter the words, the more serious the matter. The cold neon light poured down on Alexander's rigid back as he stood still in the center of the room, like a lone pillar, unmoved at the eye of the storm. On the tables strewn with tactical maps and miniature combat models simulating every street corner and alleyway of the world's fiercest conflict zones, everything seemed to freeze, as if recognizing the presence of an entity beyond their reach. Alexander McCall, the clandestine commander of Delta Force, needed no introduction, no threats. He was simply the embodiment of something that every person seated around the table, the colonels, the generals, the intelligence advisors, half revered, half feared. The silent power of a man who had walked out of the worst nightmares war could conjure. Without a word, he quietly removed his tactical gloves, placing them deliberately on the table, a gesture that ended all pretense of formal play. No one moved. Not a whisper slipped through the cracked air. Everything felt frozen by the glacial silence he carried into the room. Alexander's gaze swept the room, not with anger, not with rash fury, only with the cold detachment of a man who had counted heartbeats beneath the shriek of bullets, who had made life and death decisions in fractions of a second without a tremor. Before him, a senior officer, who had moments ago been pontificating about disputed zone strategies, lowered his head, his hands clenched, white-knuckled on his thighs. In the corner, the most seasoned security advisor flinched imperceptibly, causing the notes in his hand to rustle like insects caught in a storm. Alexander needed no words. His presence alone was a verdict, a declaration that the rules had changed, and anyone who failed to adapt would be swept away without mercy. He stepped toward the war table, where maps of vivid red and blue sprawled, each arrow and mark plotted down to the breath. A glance, a slight movement of his wrist. Then, without ceremony, he reached for the thick dossier lying at the center, a file that, just minutes before, had been passed between trembling hands with reverent caution. Alexander raised the file high, then let it fall onto the steel table. The slap of papers hitting metal cracked through the air, sharp and jarring in the choking silence, like a hammer blow to every chest in the room. The tactical map slid off the table, red arrows and strategy lines spilling onto the cold concrete floor, trampled under Alexander's boots without him so much as glancing down. Alexander lifted his head, his steely gray eyes slicing through the atmosphere like twin icy blades. His voice rang out, low, sharp, hammering into every ribcage like the blast of a starting gun. The real battle has just begun. No one answered. No one dared. No one even dared take a full breath once those words fell from Alexander McCall's lips, words that sounded like an ancient curse, a burial decree for every outdated rule. For one eternal-seeming instant, the entire room froze. The concrete walls, the blinking digital screens, the meticulously detailed analysis boards, all seemed to vanish into smoke before the crushing weight of those 5 simple words. Alexander turned on his heel. Each step he took, firm, deliberate, rang against the concrete floor, every footfall marking an end and a beginning. No haste, no hesitation, only the cold certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly who would be forced to kneel before the next dawn broke. As the steel door closed behind Alexander McCall, leaving the military briefing room frozen in suffocating silence thousands of miles away, an entirely different world roared with noise, drunkenness, and the stale stench of cheap tobacco. Inside a dingy bar tucked on the town's outskirts, dim lights flickered over scarred wooden walls and cracked leather stools, scars of a battle fought not with guns but with years of decay. Cigarette smoke hung low beneath swaying ceiling bulbs, ready to fall at any moment. There, Jason Kruger sat sprawled on a high stool, one elbow resting on the rough bar counter, a cheap whiskey glass swinging from his hand as if he were bestowing his victory upon the universe. His police shirt was unbuttoned at the top, collar wrinkled. Jason roaring with laughter, clouds of alcohol breath spilling with every boastful shout. "You should have seen me knock that old man flat," he bellowed, slamming the glass on the counter so hard that nearby beer bottles rattled. "He just lay there like a ripped-up trash bag, couldn't even lift his head to look at me." His fellow officers, Rickman, Morris, and a few other patrol lackeys, howled with laughter, their cackling blending with creaking chairs and the drunken pounding of fists on tables. In their tiny, pathetic world, that pitiful triumph was a shining medal, a golden ticket proving that power could be measured by how much humiliation they could heap onto the weak. Jason drained his whiskey, wiped his mouth with a sweaty forearm, and shouted, voice hoarse with drunken pride, "That's the rule, boys. I stomp on the old, spit on their crusty little medals, and walk off like a goddamn king. Me, Jason Kruger, king of this shithole town." The pack roared in approval, slapping backs, slamming chairs, whistling and jeering like they were crowning a hero who had conquered the world. In the corner of the bar, where broken shadows dripped between the flickering lights, an old man sat quietly over a cloudy beer. An old army jacket sagged from his shoulders, heavy boots caked with the dust of forgotten years. His face, half hidden beneath a faded wool cap, glinted with a cold, muted light, the eyes of someone who had seen more than most could bear. The old man did not drink. He's listening to every ridiculous boast, listening to every hollow laugh, listening to the stupidity that was burying itself under a collapsing roof of arrogance. When Jason threw his head back and laughed again, his voice tearing through the smoky air like a rusty hinge forced open, the old man lifted his beer, took a slow sip, and rose to his feet. The wooden chair groaned under his weight. A small sound, but enough to cause the noise around the bar to stumble for half a beat. No one turned to stare outright, but a shift, subtle, electric, bled into the room from the place where the old man stood. He moved toward the bar with slow, deliberate steps, the heavy taps of his boots echoing across the battered floorboards. Not hurried, not fearful, as if every step was another safety catch, flipped off an unseen rifle. Jason, half drunk and wholly arrogant, squinted at him. He curled his lips into a sneer. "What the hell is this?" Jason scoffed, laughing dryly, looking at the old man the way one looks at a stray mutt limping into their path. The old man stopped right beside him, set the empty beer glass down with a sharp clack against the counter, then tilted his head slightly, eyes cold, voice low and razor-sharp, cutting deeper than any blade in that sweat-soaked bar. "You just dug your grave, boy." One sentence, just one. But it dropped into the air like a boulder smashing the surface of a still pond, sending cold ripples slicing down the spines of anyone sober enough to feel it. Rickman swallowed hard, his beer glass drooping in his hand. The other patrolmen exchanged nervous glances, their laughter dying in their throats, because in the old man's eyes there was no empty threat, no bluster, only the deadly certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was saying. Jason snorted, a drunken, mocking laugh thick with cheap whiskey and smoke. He slapped the bar hard, howling as if he'd just heard the funniest joke of the year. Dig a grave? For whom, old man? For the crippled old geezers? Go crawl back to your nursing home before I throw you into the grave with that old fart from today. The old man said nothing, just stood there, eyes narrowing, as if seeing through the bloated, swaggering flesh of Jason Kruger to the end that Jason himself could not yet fathom. Jason kept laughing, waving dismissively as if swatting away a fly, barking at the bartender to pour another drink. He had no idea that from the moment a metal badge scraped against an old shirt sleeve inside a faded wooden house, his countdown had begun. He had no idea that the last laugh of his life would not be the sneering bark of a man stomping others underfoot. It would be a dry, hollow chuckle, adrift before his entire little world collapsed into the coldest silence he had ever known. Jason Kruger's raspy laughter still lingered in the air, thick with cheap whiskey and tobacco smoke, a stupid echo spilling through the battered doors of the seedy bar. But outside the night had shifted, no longer the warm, sleepy darkness of a town gone to bed, but a heavy, suffocating gloom, as if the very air were holding its breath. On the gravel road leading into town, the headlights of a black SUV tore through the darkness. The engine growled, low and deep, like a predator crouching before the final lunge. The vehicle slid past crooked trees, its beams flickering across battered storefront signs and shuttered wooden houses, casting warped shadows like desperate hands clawing from memories. Inside the dark cabin, Alexander McCall sat behind the wheel, body leaning slightly forward, arms hard as steel gripping the steering wheel. His battle uniform bore no insignia, no rank, no unit colors, only sharp, clean cuts of fabric and a silence so absolute it seemed to smother every fiber. No music, no whisper, only steady, controlled breathing, the breath of a war machine honed to cold perfection. In the breeze slipping through the cracked window, the scent of burnt grass and dry dust mixed, but in Alexander's mind there remained only the metallic tang of bullets, blood, and faraway battlefields where hesitation was death. On the dashboard, tucked into the corner, was a small photograph, an old man in a faded uniform, his face stern but his eyes soft. Robert McCall, the father, the warrior, the man who had summoned him with a wordless command no true son could refuse. Alexander's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening beneath tactical gloves. No strategy was needed, no map. The destination had been marked from the moment a metal badge scraped against an old shirt sleeve, and that silent call had thundered through Alexander's veins like the final war drum summoning the dead. At the town center, the bar flickered weakly like a dying coal. The red neon "open" sign dangling by the door sputtered and buzzed, as if whispering a last warning to a place oblivious that the storm was already pressing against its door. The black SUV approached, headlights cutting off a few hundred meters out. Alexander shifted gears, the engine growling low, not as a threat, but like a quiet curse. He drew his Glock 19 from its holster, chambering around with such fluid precision it bypassed conscious thought. The cold click of metal was soft, final, like the shutting of a door no hand could open again. Inside the bar, Jason Kruger was downing his sixth glass, laughing uproariously, slapping Rickman on the back, roaring out a vulgar story about breaking an old man's ribs while reporting it as resisting arrest. His pack of drunken comrades howled like penned hunting dogs, oblivious that they were baying at the gates of their own graveyard. Outside, The darkness thickened, as if even the stars had drawn back from what was about to unfold. Alexander stepped out of the SUV, silent, his boots pressed lightly against the hardened dirt, leaving no trace, no echo. His shadow stretched under the dim streetlight, merging into the night like a black arrow tearing through the wind. He advanced toward the bar's door, unhurried, unwavering, every step nailing itself into the rotting wood of this forsaken place. The wooden door creaked a hoarse protest as he pushed it open, a gust of cold air sweeping in, carrying the stink of booze, smoke, and stale sweat. No one inside noticed. No heads turned. The self-proclaimed king of the town stood with his back to the door, waving a beer glass, his throat alive with drunken howls. Alexander stood there, silent as a ghost. No roar, no warning. He glanced around, the peeling baseball posters, the sagging chairs, the men who had sold their souls for a fleeting, cheap swagger. His eyes locked onto Jason, a gaze colder than ice, and in that instant, the battlefield was drawn. No verdict needed, no jury summoned, only one undeniable truth. The blood debt would be paid. Alexander's hand tightened slightly. Still, no one in the room sensed what was about to descend upon them. Jason howled with laughter, tilted back his final glass and hurled it to the floor, shattering it with a crash. He spun around, roaring, "Which one of you cowards is still sitting down? Drink! Drink to the vic—" He never finished. His eyes collided with Alexander, and in that fraction of a second, drunk, arrogant, ignorant, some primitive survival instinct whispered up his spine. Everything had just ended. The moment Jason's eyes locked onto Alexander's, the alcohol in his blood seemed to freeze with a single contracting heartbeat. He stood paralyzed in the smoky, sweat-stained bar, his breath caught in his throat like a child caught stealing. The instinct to retreat, to flee, surged within him, but the arrogance of a man used to mocking the rules held him frozen, twisted into the posture of an animal cornered. Alexander McCall advanced, not rushing, not lunging, just moving with a calm, solid force, each step hammering into the warped wooden floor like nails into a coffin. Around the room, drunken heads began to lift, the suffocating air squeezing the bar tighter, stretching every breath, crushing every lingering laugh. Rickman, Jason's loyal sidekick, half rose from his seat, but his hand froze on his belt when Alexander's icy gaze brushed past. That single glance was enough to freeze him solid, dropping him back down like a sack of emptiness. Jason tried to smile. A twisted, pitiful grin smeared across his flushed face, unable to mask the disgrace rising through his drunken bravado. "Oh," he stammered, throat dry, struggling to force a mockery of arrogance into his voice. "Fresh meat, huh? Want an autograph or a good beating to remember me by?" Alexander stopped 3 steps away from Jason, the distance between two men, one a hollow wall of arrogance, the other a silent storm capable of drowning everything without even raising its voice. Alexander said nothing. He didn't waste a single word. His eyes, cold, deep, bottomless, locked onto Jason's, squeezing his heartbeat, squeezing the blood vessels in his neck like an invisible hand, choking the life out of him, without even touching him. Jason sneered, glancing frantically for backup, but found only pale faces, darting eyes, and trembling hands gripping cheap beer glasses. No one stood with him, not a single soul. Alexander slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing a forearm hardened by years of living and dying on battlefields Jason Kruger could never even dream of standing upon. Jason swallowed hard, his voice cracking, snapping like a stray mutt barking to mask its fear. "You know who I am, punk? I'm a cop here. I have the right—" Alexander cut him off. The only way a battlefield teaches. A single glance, sharp as a knife blade slitting the air. Jason froze, feeling as if an invisible force had shoved him half a step back. Alexander moved forward, 1 step, just one, and the whole room seemed to shrink away. Jason stumbled, slapping his hand down to reach for his gun, but before his fingers even grazed the holster, Alexander was there. No weapon needed, no shouting. Alexander only needed one movement. Swift, clean, precise, like the lethal swipe of an elite assassin's blade. His hand shot up, locking Jason's wrist mid-air, squeezing it with the unyielding grip of cold steel. Jason howled, knees buckling, face twisting in agony and terror. Alexander yanked Jason closer, their faces inches apart, his voice rumbling low, each word pounding straight into Jason's skull. True power. Doesn't need a badge, Jason gasped, flailing like a fish out of water. But it was useless. Alexander's strength didn't scream. It pressed, crushed, grinding Jason's wrist joints like a vice crushing a walnut. Rickman jumped up but only managed one step before Alexander's second glance. Colder, crueler, froze him mid-gamer. His feet rooted to the floor, Alexander leaned in, voice dropping to a deadly whisper. But in the graveyard hush of the bar, everyone heard it. You touched something you were never worthy of touching. Jason gasped for breath, sweat freezing down his spine. The drunkenness evaporated from his body like mist struck by a blizzard. Alexander released him. Jason collapsed onto the floor, wheezing, his whole body shivering like a discarded rag. Alexander stood tall, sweeping his gaze across the bar, not speaking another word, but each glance branding its own scalding mark onto the cowering faces and shrinking souls around him. He turned. His boots hammered a steady rhythm onto the battered wood, each step announcing the same decree. Not vengeance, not intimidation, execution. A sentence carried out without the need for any paper proof. The bar door swung open, letting the cold night air rush in, sweeping the stench of irreversibility through the room. Alexander McCall disappeared into the darkness. Behind him remained only a crumpled Jason Kruger on the floor, and a room full of men learning for the first time in their lives what it meant to bow before a power that did not need a gun to command. The night wind slapped Alexander's face, gritty with dust and the scent of rusted steel. But he didn't falter, not for a single heartbeat. His strides carried him back to the waiting black SUV, clean, precise, like an artillery unit breaking camp at the order to move. The engine growled to life with a single twist of the wrist. No extra gas, no wasted breath. The SUV slid silently from the empty lot, ghosting through narrow streets where shuttered windows and bolted doors cowered like frightened children hiding behind their mother's skirts, knowing that something terrible had just been unleashed. It took less than 3 minutes to reach the town's police headquarters, a squat, gray, crumbling building as decayed as the rotting systems festering inside it. The flickering neon light above the door barely illuminated the rusting plaque. Elm Ridge Police Department. The letters bleeding the last drops of dignity from a structure once meant to protect, but now merely clinging to hollow illusions of power. Alexander stepped out of the SUV, without locking it, without a glance around. He crossed the cracked courtyard, his boots striking the worn bricks with steady, undeniable authority. The sliding glass door whined pitifully as it opened. The front desk was nearly empty, manned by a sleepy young officer whose cap slumped over his eyes, oozing the careless indifference of those who wore power without understanding responsibility. Alexander didn't spare him a glance. He walked straight to the door marked Sheriff Gordon Pike in tarnished gold lettering. He didn't knock. He shoved the door open with a clean, decisive push, making the entire room jump. A fat, balding man with a red, alcohol-soaked face lounged lazily behind a battered wooden desk, his feet propped up, fingers drumming idly against a cold coffee mug. Hearing the door slam, Gordon's bleary eyes snapped up, narrowing in suspicion. Alexander stepped into the office, moving like a storm cutting across a dead field, without the slightest concern for the false formalities this place still pretended to uphold. Gordon raised an eyebrow, grumbling with drunken disdain. "You know where you are, buddy? Got any paperwork before you come busting in?" Alexander didn't answer. He reached into his battle-worn jacket and pulled out a small, rectangular object, placing it lightly, almost reverently, on the desk. A military ID card. Black. No logo. No colors. Only 3 words engraved in cold silver. Delta Force No. Neon light needed. No explanation necessary. The desk lamp's glow caught the surface of the card, and the entire room dropped toward freezing. Gordon Pike froze in his seat, throat rasping out dry, hollow noises. He stared at the card like it had risen from the dead, and in that instant, all his swagger, his beer-fueled bravado, peeled away to reveal the trembling bones of a burrow rat. Alexander, still calm, withdrew a second object from his pocket, a thick, hard-bound file stamped with a deep crimson watermark. Top secret. He dropped it atop the Delta Force card with a heavy thud that echoed like a nail hammering into a coffin. Gordon swallowed hard, his plump hands clenching the armrests until his knuckles turned white. What do you want?" he stammered, voice trembling like a frayed cable about to snap. Alexander lifted his gaze, locking onto Gordon with the weight of a contained storm. "What I want," he said, voice low and hammering each word straight into Gordon's brain, "isn't within the tiny little laws of this rotten town." Gordon opened his mouth to protest, but his gaze dropped to the Delta Force card, and the vein throbbing at his temple looked ready to burst. Alexander calmly retrieved the card, sliding it back into his jacket, the movement as fluid as an assassin sheathing a blade. The top secret file remained on the desk, a silent, final warning. He leaned in, voice raw but deathly clear. "You will listen, you will act, and you will stay silent. Not a threat, not a request, a fact. As certain as the sun rising after the longest night, Gordon Pike dared not even breathe heavily." He nodded, a weak, broken nod, like a raw recruit bowing before a general stepping from a battlefield littered with enemy corpses. Alexander straightened his jacket, smoothing the cuffs, his eyes sweeping the room once more, freezing any lingering thought of resistance into stone. No one in that room, not even Gordon Pike, needed any more paperwork. Alexander McCall's presence was the only evidence needed, and now the execution of judgment had begun. The door of the police station slammed shut behind Alexander McCall, leaving behind a lobby filled with frozen men, nailed in place by shame and terror they had never known before. The night wind slashed across his face, cold and sharp as a blade, stripping away the thin, crumbling illusions clinging to this rotten town. He walked straight into the wasteland behind the station, a patch of cracked, frozen earth where broken streetlights cast deep shadows that swallowed even the weak breaths of those who once strutted, mocking real law. The wind whipped the hem of Alexander's battle jacket, snapping it like the banner of an invisible army. He stood there, tall and immovable, like a lone monument abandoned on a forgotten battlefield. His gaze swept across the emptiness, as if seeing the ghosts this town had either forgotten or had chosen to forget behind him. Jason Kruger was dragged out, hands cuffed painfully behind his back, face as pale as a corpse. The sour stench of liquor and fear oozed from every pore of his body, mingling with the cold earth and rusted iron, rising into a nauseating vapor that tainted the air. He stumbled forward, head bowed like a beaten dog, forced step by two officers whose eyes couldn't meet Alexander's, shadow stretching long across the ground. Alexander did not immediately look at Jason. He lifted his head, staring into the thick black sky where a few lonely stars were being devoured by the indifferent clouds. In that moment, memories rushed back, like artillery fire rumbling over distant lands, like the smell of blood and gunpowder soaked into every fold of a battle-worn uniform. Names, faces, all those who, through ignorance or arrogance, had dared to challenge him. Deacon Marrow, the infamous warlord, gunned down in the red dust of Somalia before he could even draw his weapon. Major Victor Helms, the traitor, found floating in a flooded alleyway in Caracas, eyes wide open in terror. Saeed al-Hassan, the terrorist arms dealer, who vanished without a trace one night in the Golden Triangle, leaving only a gold ring washed ashore by the river. All of them. Not one had stood against the name Alexander McCall. Not one. Alexander lowered his gaze. Jason Kruger looked up at him through sweaty, matted hair, his cloudy eyes flickering with a mixture of overwhelming fear and shredded pride. A man who had trampled on the honor of others to climb his way onto a rotten pedestal of power, Now trembling before someone he had foolishly thought he could provoke and brush aside, Alexander stepped forward. Jason instinctively recoiled, his foot catching in the hard earth, sending him sprawling to the ground like a deflated sack of bones. Alexander paused, his voice cutting through the frozen air. Deep, clear, cold as sharpened steel. "Who do you think I am?" Jason opened his mouth, but only managed a choked sob. Alexander bent down, grabbing Jason by the collar and lifting him effortlessly, like plucking a blade of grass. He slammed Jason's gaze directly into his own. "Delta Force?" Alexander asked, the ghost of a cold smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's just a name on paper." He dropped Jason with a heavy thud. The tip of his boot lightly tapped Jason's ribs, not hard, but enough to wring a howl of humiliation from him. Alexander straightened, arms relaxed at his sides, each word falling like a scalpel slicing into the rotten flesh of Jason's crumbling pride. "I am the ghost that haunts the nightmares of terrorists. I am the name traitors whisper in the dead of night, praying I never step out from the shadows." The wind howled across the wasteland, rattling the handcuffs with a hollow metallic clatter. Jason curled into himself, paralyzed with terror. Alexander slowly circled him, his boots crunching across the cracked ground, each step pounding judgment into the earth. "You," Alexander said, his voice low and heavy, "Jason Kruger, are nothing but a coward in a uniform, a drunken fool clinging to the illusion of power with blood-stained hands that have only known how to crush the innocent." He stopped behind Jason, his voice dropping into a deep drumbeat of finality. "And now you will pay." He gave a small, sharp hand signal. The two officers dragged Jason to his feet and hauled him toward the rusted flagpole standing crooked in the center of the wasteland, a rotting monument to a justice system long since defiled by men like him. Alexander watched without flinching. There would be no torture, no bullets. Quick death was too merciful for filth like Jason. Instead, he would be tied to the flagpole, exposed, humiliated, under the cold, dead stares of the very people he had once oppressed, mocked, and trampled underfoot. The humiliation was the sentence. The graveyard silence drowning the wasteland was the sentence Alexander approached, stopping just before Jason, his voice dropping to a near whisper, offering Jason one last mercy. The last one laughing is never the one who shows contempt. Jason squeezed his eyes shut. Tears and snot ran freely down his sweat-streaked face, a pitiful river of fear and surrender. Alexander turned away. Each step he took back across the wasteland left heavy imprints, carved deep into the earth, and deeper still, into the marrow of those still standing, frozen too afraid to even breathe. And from the darkness, a legend began to whisper its way through every locked door and shuttered window, of a man who had walked out of the battlefield, and of those foolish enough to underestimate him, who never got a second chance to regret it. The door of the police station closed behind Alexander McCall with a heavy thud, sealing inside a thick atmosphere, so dense that even each breath carried the scent of despair. Jason Kruger was shoved down onto the lobby floor, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face bleached pale with terror, the rancid smell of old liquor rising from every tangled strand of his disheveled hair. The four cold walls closed in around him like a tomb tightening, and within that tomb he had no weapon, no allies, no way out. Alexander stood still in the center of the station, his steel-gray eyes devoid of expression, sweeping silently across every face slicked with sweat despite the cutting chill of the night. Every small sound, the static crackle of the radios, the heavy ticks of the clock's second hand, rang out with a deafening clarity, each one pounding into the hearts of those seated there, too afraid to breathe too loudly. Sheriff Gordon Pike glanced at Alexander, then at Jason, crumpled on the floor like a cornered animal. Gordon's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, his bloated face now ashen, his vacant eyes reflecting the hollow realization that he too was nothing more than a rotting plank, adrift before an unstoppable wave. A bead of sweat, thick and sluggish, slithered down Gordon's temple, gleaming under the harsh light like an oil slick over a sunken ship, and in that fleeting moment, Gordon knew there would be no more excuses. They had all crossed too far past the line where forgiveness could reach. Jason Kruger shivered violently. His frantic eyes searched for rescue, but found only downcast gazes, hunched shoulders. No one lifted their head, no one stood for him. A young officer, shrinking into the wall, trembled so badly that his pistol slipped from its holster and clattered onto the floor with a cold, brutal clack, a sound sharper and more devastating than any shouted accusation. Jason swallowed hard, the noise pathetic against the vast, suffocating silence, while the gun's slow roll across the tile carved deep into the brittle air choking the station. Gordon Pike forced out a growl, his voice grinding between clenched teeth. "Jason, you know exactly what you're facing now." He was no longer the sheriff, no longer a man who could issue orders, just a breathing corpse, carried helplessly by a flood he had once foolishly believed he could command. Jason tried to shake his head, tried to summon a last scrap of defiance, but the frail illusion shattered under Alexander's cold, detached gaze, crumbling like glass under a steel boot. Alexander did not move. He stood there, wrapped in a dense aura of gravity, as if his mere presence had doubled the weight of the room. No threats, no sneers, just silence. A silence that stripped away dignity, piece by piece, bleeding out every last gasp of pride from those who once thought themselves above others. A dry, sharp slap echoed from the corner when a veteran officer, long silently enduring Jason's tyranny, smashed his folder onto the wooden table, threw his badge on top of it, and walked straight out of the station without a single glance back. No words needed. The fracture could no longer be repaired. Gordon stepped closer to Jason, grabbing his collar and yanking him upright, spitting every word into Jason's quivering face. "You will apologize publicly, to everyone, to his family. If there's even a speck of sense left in you, you'll know. If you don't, every man here dies with you." Jason exhaled sharply, as if someone had driven a fist into his gut. A thin stream of milky saliva spilled from the corner of his mouth, dripping onto his rumpled uniform like a final insult. Desperately, Jason's eyes darted toward the command desk, toward the plaque that bore the unit's collective commendation, once symbolizing their honor. But under the sickly yellow lights, the glass shimmered not like glory, but like a cold, meaningless gravestone. I, he stammered, his voice cracking into pitiful fragments. Gordon did not relent. He shook Jason violently, the sound of tearing fabric harsh and raw in the frozen air. "One apology could still save you from an end you cannot undo, not for yourself, for all of us. Understand, you fool," Jason hiccuped, foul reeking breath mingling with the stench of raw fear and rotting humiliation, like a wounded animal cornered by the sharpest blade it had ever felt. Outside the glass, the night wind screamed in bitter gusts, mocking, scornful, and somewhere amid the chaos a dropped cell phone still blinked erratically across the cold tile, its mad flickering light signaling that control was lost. Alexander remained perfectly still. Only his gaze, steady and deep, locked Jason in place like a silent verdict, needing no jury to confirm it. Jason shook violently. He knew. He knew there was no choice left. No one left to grasp onto. No rights left to wave like a rotted shield. Behind him, the sounds of retreat, the scuff of shoes on tile, the sharp intakes of breath, as officers who once rallied beside him now pulled away, one by one, shrinking from him as though his very existence had become a stain no one dared to touch. Jason's head hung low, his shoulders slumped, and his body sagged to the floor like a hollowed-out carcass. He croaked, his voice thin and wet as torn paper. I will apologize." But even as the words scraped from his dry throat, another sound cut across them, a sharp, sickening crack. It was not the walls breaking nor the tiles, but something far worse, the fracturing of something abstract yet absolute. Credibility, pride, every oath once pinned to the badge Jason thought would shield him forever. An old officer, the one who had once mentored Jason, stepped out from the corner of the room, moved slowly, and removed his own badge from his chest. He placed it solemnly on the table and left, without a single word. The apology Jason gasped out was not born from repentance nor remorse, but from pure primal terror. The terror of being crushed completely under the silent, relentless stare of a man Jason had been too foolish to challenge. Gordon Pike shoved Jason forward like a bag of rotting garbage thrown onto the street. Jason stumbled, knees buckling, scraping his hand along a freezing puddle, leaving behind a dirty smear, a pitiful trail marking the last crawl of a wounded beast toward inevitable ruin. Alexander watched it all without change. No smile of triumph, no nod of satisfaction. He did not need it. True victory required no celebration. Jason Kruger, once the self-proclaimed pillar of this town, now lay a trembling wreck, about to be dragged into the public square, where his half-hearted apology would rip the last shreds of his shattered pride, would bleed away the very last drops he had left to cling to. The night outside the cracked glass window remained thick and impenetrable. Jason Kruger still knelt on the floor, his body shriveled into itself, sweat soaking through the back of his shirt, his face bleached pale from a depth of fear he had never tasted before. He had nodded. He had agreed to apologize, but Alexander had not budged. Standing in the frigid room, he was a statue carved from ice and steel, his gaze never leaving Jason, a stare clouded with contempt, colder than the endless night outside the shattered window. Gordon Pike slowly approached, his plump hand hurriedly wiping sweat from his forehead, struggling to find a voice that even he no longer recognized. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock sharp, official press conference. You, Jason, will stand before the entire media and the townspeople. You will apologize to Robert McCall, publicly, clearly, no excuses, no blaming circumstances or misunderstandings, no justification, no softening. He paused, his dry eyes boring into Jason like a sentencing judge. In the corner, a security camera swiveled quietly, emitting a cold click, as if it too was poised to record the final collapse of a man. You will bow your head and admit your wrongdoing. Understood? Jason opened his mouth, and a guttural rasp, like the dragging moan of a corpse, scraped from his throat. He gaped uselessly, searching for a lifeline, begging for mercy, but none was given. No door cracked open, no sympathetic glance offered. An officer standing nearby instinctively recoiled, stepping back as if merely brushing against Jason would taint him with the disgrace now seeping from his very pores. Alexander stood silently, unmoving. No raised hand, no clenched fist, only a calm, glacial stare, yet within that stillness the full weight of true justice crushed down upon Jason, splintering him bone by bone. Overhead, a flickering bulb cast a sickly yellow wash across Jason's face, highlighting each bead of sweat rolling backward down his ashen temple, as if even his body was desperately seeking a way to escape the impending humiliation. "No," Jason gasped in desperation, his voice snapping like a rotted string. I can't. It was just a misunderstanding." "Are you all right?" A shadow swept across his vision. Gordon, consumed by a fury so dense it thickened the very air, slammed his fist onto the table with a crack sharp as a gunshot. "There was no misunderstanding. No excuses," Gordon roared, the shout ricocheting off the walls and pounding into every chest, even those who had secretly hoped to duck the coming storm. Jason looked around and saw only averted faces, gazes sliding toward the floor, as if trying to flee a verdict already rendered beyond appeal. "You will admit fault. You will bear the shame." Gordon's voice tightened, strangling Jason like a noose slipping around his neck, dragging him down the slippery slope of truth. A dry, brittle sound cracked through the room, Jason's badge falling to the ground. The tiny metal emblem spun across the cold tile, each rotation driving another spike into the shriveled remnants of his pride. And Gordon kept going, each word a hammer blow. "You will stand there and let the entire town see your filthy face, and know you are the one who betrayed the badge you once wore over your heart." A violent convulsion twisted Jason's gut. He tried to steady himself, but his legs betrayed him, trembling beyond control. His body swayed like a marionette whose strings had been cut. No one touched him, no one shoved him. But Jason collapsed, his forehead striking the floor with a hollow thud, not from any outside force, but from the sheer unbearable weight of truth pressing down with nothing left to hold him up. Alexander remained motionless, not even a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. His contempt needed no words. The silence itself was sharper than any blade. Jason lifted his head, his tear-soaked eyes clawing at the empty air, like a drowning man flailing against inevitability. But it was too late. His honor, his authority, the hollow pride he had built for years by trampling others, all of it crumbled brick by brick under him. Gordon turned to look at Alexander, his gaze pleading, desperate, and above all, terrified. Terrified that if Jason dared resist even now, if he refused to bow before the community, Alexander would not speak another word before reducing the entire Elmridge department to ashes no one dared salvage. The room held its breath, the tick-tock of the wall clock hammering down like a war drum against nerves stretched to the breaking point. Alexander gave a slight nod, a simple, slight nod. But for Gordon, it felt like an execution sentence that mercifully stayed at the last second. The air thickened even further, heavy enough to crush the frantic heartbeat stuttering inside Jason's chest, each thready beat echoing like the whimpers of a cornered animal. Gordon gripped Jason's shoulders, squeezing down as if to crush the last flickers of defiance. "You will apologize in front of all Elmridge. You will not use words like oversight, misunderstanding, or unintentional. You will admit everything. You will say you were wrong, nothing more, nothing less." Gordon's breath reeked of stale cigarettes, mixing with the acrid stench of fear that now suffocated the room, a stench only the witnesses to the collapse of rotten power would ever recognize. Jason shrank further, his eyes bulging wide in terror. A static-laden announcement crackled over the old PA system outside the hallway. "The Elmridge Police Department scandal is expected to hold a press conference tomorrow morning." The words struck Jason like a slap, a brutal reminder that every escape route had been sealed, that the world outside already knew, already watched, and no lie could bury the truth now. Gordon leaned close, his voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper. "If you don't, you won't exist anymore. None of us will." "Understand, you idiot," Jason sobbed, his throat rasping like dry leaves crushed underfoot. The lights above flickered violently, as if the very wiring recoiled from the impending downfall. A young officer staggered against the wall, scattering a stack of papers across the floor with a frantic rustle. The noise made Jason flinch, like a gunshot had gone off next to his ear. He nodded, a trembling, broken nod, but this time it was real. No more hiding, no more pretending, only the full collapse of a man who had once believed a badge could shield him from every sin he had committed. Outside the smudged window, a cluster of reporters had already gathered. Cameras glinted red, blinking like predatory eyes ready to shred whatever scraps of deception remained. Alexander checked his watch, the only movement he had made thus far. A small, deliberate gesture, a confirmation that the time for bargaining had ended. He turned. His broad, cold figure swept across the room, like the final stroke of a broom wiping away the last rotten illusions. Tomorrow, before the morning sun could even warm the frozen earth, Jason Kruger would stand before the cameras, the microphones, and the very town he had once trampled underfoot. And he would no longer be able to hide behind excuses, no longer cling to flimsy defenses. He would bow his head and confess every crime from his own lips. Because Alexander McCall did not punish with bullets. He was punished by striking the one place where no wound ever truly healed. Pride. Morning crept into Elmridge with a pale, sickly light, like the brittle skin stretched over a town that had long since rotted beneath. The biting wind tore through the narrow streets, rattling rusted signs and shredding the faded American flags hanging limp above crumbling porches. But today, no one paid attention to the weather. The entire town had swarmed toward the central square like a hive torn open. Silent, packed tight, carrying in their eyes a complex storm of emotions, anticipation, fury, and a fierce hunger to witness the downfall of a false idol. At the center of the square stood a hastily erected wooden platform. No banners, no loudspeakers, no polished stage like the town's previous ceremonies. Only a single microphone, standing bare against the vast, cold space, as solitary and exposed as the man about to face it. The early wind tore across the square, scattering leftover scraps of paper, ripping apart the last shreds of the town's pretended dignity. No lawyers, no defense. Only the community, those Jason Kruger had once crushed beneath his boots, now stood together in a massive horseshoe ring, tightening around the platform like a wall of judgment. The ropes binding the platform like a wall of judgment, needing no jury. Jason stepped forward, each footfall heavier than the last, dragging invisible chains, his head bowed low, his shoulders sagging, every step scraping against the frozen concrete like the sobbing of a man whose spine had finally snapped. His uniform was crumpled, stained with patches of old liquor at the collar, his black shoes scuffed and dusty, transforming him into a pitiful ghost, a wretched remnant of the proud officer he once pretended to be. A stray dog wandered into the square, loping lazily across the path of the crowd. No one shooed it away. Its presence, forgotten and ignored, mirrored Jason's own, an unwanted thing left to rot in plain sight. Whispers rippled across the gathering as Jason shuffled toward the microphone. Those he had humiliated, those who had swallowed back tears under his abuse, now they stood here, stone silent. A young boy, clutching his mother's hand, whispered, "Is that him?" The innocent question slicing through Jason's eardrums like a scalpel, making him stagger. The colossal silence weighed down on him, pinning each breath in jagged bursts. As if every gasp was another unspoken accusation, Alexander McCall stood off to the side, arms folded across his chest, his gaze sharp as frost, tracking Jason's every move without saying a word. He didn't need to step forward. He didn't need to shout. His very presence thickened the air into a wall Jason could not breach. A young officer who had once idolized Jason quietly slipped the nameplate from his chest and stuffed it into his pocket, as if desperately severing the final thread tying him to disgrace. A window creaked open on the second floor of the town hall. Old faces peered down, the ones who had once trusted the system, once pinned their hopes onto a badge Jason had now defiled. An elderly man raised his phone shakily, not to broadcast, but to record this moment. The fall of a figure once called justice, crumbling under the weight of his own corruption. Jason swallowed hard. His fingers trembling, he clutched the crumpled sheet shoved into his hands the night before. Scrawled words, hastily penned, carrying the weight of 1,000 verdicts heavier than any court could deliver. Under the sickly streetlights, the ink blurred and ran like blood dripping from old wounds. He glanced at the crowd, a sea of cold, unblinking eyes, and sucked in a ragged breath, chest heaving like it might burst. Somewhere in the square, a camera shutter clicked, a small sound, but sharp and lethal as a hidden dagger driving him deeper into the mire. His voice cracked out, harsh, broken, disjointed. "I, Jason Kruger," he choked, fingers crushing the paper in his grasp, eyes lowered like a child caught stealing. Sweat streamed down his forehead, dripping onto the shaking paper, smudging the ink into a smear of shame. "I apologize to Mr. Robert McCall." Each word tore out from deep inside, each syllable a blade slicing through the last tattered scraps of his pride. A strong gust ripped across the square, lifting Jason's sweat-slicked hair and exposing the pallid, blotchy wreck of his face. He paused, shuddering like a reed battered by a storm. He wanted to vomit, wanted to collapse, but his legs locked him in place, forcing him to remain upright under the raw, merciless gaze of the town. In the crowd, an elderly woman whom Jason had once publicly humiliated raised an old photograph, a bruised face, twisted in shame. Jason caught sight of it, and his body reeled, as if he had been punched squarely in the gut. "I was wrong," he rasped, his voice strangled by invisible hands. The paper suddenly ripped free from his trembling fingers, caught by the wind, swirling once in the bitter air, before landing at the feet of Alexander McCall. Alexander bent down, picked it up, gave it a single glacial glance, then folded it and slipped it into his pocket without a word. As if stripping away the last flimsy shield Jason might cling to, there was no misunderstanding, no justification. "No one but me is responsible," Jason croaked, the words bleeding out of his raw throat, each one dragging bloodied shreds of self-worth with it. His vision blurred with tears, but he dared not raise a hand to wipe them away, terrified that any movement might shatter what little of him was left. The square remained silent, no applause, no shouts, only the cold wind threading through the huddled bodies, rustling jackets, and homemade signs, each bearing a single word, scrawled in shaky hands: justice. Ones flashed like 1,000 unblinking eyes, recording, immortalizing every pitiful twitch of Jason's body, leaving him nowhere to hide. He swallowed down the sobs. He knew. Every word he spoke now was not to seek forgiveness. It was to brand himself deeper, carving into his flesh the undeniable, irredeemable truth. He had lost. Not in a fistfight, not in a courtroom, but in the only battle that mattered. The battle for dignity. Alexander McCall had not needed a bullet to destroy him. He had simply torn away the veil and left Jason to face the grotesque ruin he had become. Whispers drifted through the square, fragments of disdain falling like shards of broken glass, cutting into the last fragile layers Jason had wrapped around his rotted core. His voice broke into raw, bloody gasps. "I apologize to the citizens of Elmridge. I betray the trust placed in me." A dry, hacking cough tore through him, forcing him to double over, wheezing like a wounded animal bleeding out under the glare of countless upraised phones. No one moved to help. No one spoke. The crowd simply stood, impassive as a wall of stone. Somewhere, a video camera whirred softly, its mechanical eye slicing into the moment, dissecting his collapse. A teenager in a black hoodie, standing at the square's edge, lifted a cardboard sign. "We saw," but when Jason's blurred eyes caught them, it felt as if he had been gutted, laid bare to the marrow. The wooden platform beneath him groaned and creaked, as if even it could no longer bear the weight of his humiliation. Jason clutched his hand so tightly that his frozen fingers cracked audibly. The sound was thin, brittle, the sound of something irreversibly broken inside him. Another gust of wind slammed into him, making him sway. But he stayed upright, not from courage, but from the grim knowledge that collapsing now would be a final, irrevocable defeat. From the crowd, a small child clutched her mother's leg, tilting her head and asking innocently, "Mom, why is he crying?" Alexander never looked away. In his gaze, there was no triumph, only a cold certainty. This was justice. Justice without courts, without juries, without lawyers to plead or shield, only guilt, and the naked, inescapable exposure of the one who had wrought it. The microphone fell silent, but the final silence was not forgiveness. It was a sentence, pronounced without a gavel, without a judge, delivered solely through the cold, heavy stares of hundreds of people who had grown utterly disgusted with the rot masquerading as authority. Jason Kruger stood frozen on the platform, his face ashen, cold sweat beading along his temples, while down in the square, the people of Elmridge neither threw stones, nor shouted, nor shook. They simply stood there, silent, their eyes slicing through his disgraced flesh like silent, neat, ruthless blades. Alexander McCall stood with arms folded in the distance, his gaze devoid of emotion, like a cold deity witnessing a verdict being carried out by the community itself, without the need for a gun or a courtroom. When Jason staggered off the platform, his legs trembling, the crowd instinctively parted, creating a narrow path like a fissure in the earth reserved for the exiled. No one touched him, no one spoke a word, no jeers, no curses, Only silence, thick and heavier than any death sentence. His footsteps struck the concrete with dry, ragged echoes, like the knocking of a lost soul. In the air, thick with dampness and the faint scent of disinfectant from the nearby hospital, Jason passed familiar faces. The grocers, who once greeted him with smiles. The mothers, who once nodded politely as he patrolled. The children, who once clung fearfully to their parents at the sight of his uniform. Now, all those faces had become cold statues, unmoving, expressing nothing but disgust. A dry leaf, carried by the wind from somewhere, snagged against Jason's shoe, clinging to his dragging steps, as if even nature was forced to bear witness to this disgraceful exile. Across the street, the bakery door stood ajar, and an old woman, half hidden in the shadows, held a tray of fresh, warm pastries. Upon seeing Jason, she quietly retreated inside, shutting the door as if to keep the contamination from crossing her threshold. Jason turned onto Main Street, his palms cold and numb, the police badge in his pocket weighing so heavily that each step seemed to sink deeper into the ground. In the distance, the wind chimes outside the familiar cafe clinked in broken, stuttering tones, each chime sounding like a cold farewell from a place that had once been the town's pride. He tried to walk faster, but it was as if invisible hands tightened around his knees. Each step sent a searing pain from his heels up his spine. He entered the familiar general store, where once he had only needed to signal, and the shopkeeper would happily package whatever he wanted. This time, however, the shopkeeper, middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and trembling hands, who once counted money in Jason's presence, turned his back without a glance, as if Jason no longer existed. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically with each of Jason's uncertain steps, casting a jaundiced glow that seemed to sink his wrinkled uniform into the decaying colors of corruption. Jason stood still for a few seconds, his hand awkwardly suspended in the air, stung by a shame sharper than the late autumn morning's chill. He dragged himself to the small cafe at the end of the street, where he once arrogantly ordered the homeless to be removed from the doorway. Now, as he pushed open the door, every eye turned away. The owner did not come out. The young waitress, who used to offer him shy smiles each morning, now scrubbed the counter with exaggerated care, as if even the filthiest floors deserved more attention than his presence. A customer by the window, a middle-aged man who once offered Jason free coffee on holidays, quietly set down his cup, pulled out his wallet, left a few small bills, and walked out without so much as a backward glance. Jason stood there, his throat parched, wanting to order, wanting to pretend nothing had happened. But deep within those averted eyes, he read a truth more brutal than any indictment. Here, he was already dead. Dead without a bullet, a knife, or an official verdict. Outside the dusty window pane, two small children clutched each other's hands, staring at him. When Jason's eyes met theirs, the older child immediately yanked the younger one away, as if even 1 second's contact could contaminate them. Jason shuffled onward, his feet dragging across the cobblestones, leaving faint, scratchy sounds that grated against the tightly compressed, cold air. Every door, every window shutter slammed shut as he passed, like a foul wind blowing through town. A barber shop he once entered like a king now reacted differently. The heavily tattooed young barber silently flipped the closed sign to face outwards, pulled the curtain shut, and disappeared inside without a word. The once familiar shops rejected him with utter indifference. No one bothered to frown, no one wasted breath on insults, for it was that indifference, complete absence of hatred or pity, that became the ultimate execution. He passed an old woman who used to sell pastries in the square, who once slipped him free treats during holiday festivals. Now she clutched her basket to her chest and took a full step back as Jason approached, as if breathing the same air would contaminate her. Alexander walked slowly behind Jason, silent, unhurried, needing no intervention. His presence, quiet, cold as a blade, choked each of Jason's miserable steps, turning the whole town into a court without a judge, without a defense, with only verdicts written in averted gazes and slammed doors. Overhead, The sky sagged heavy with gray clouds, threatening to unleash a dreary rain, but even if it rained, Jason knew no storm could wash away his sins in this place. When he stopped at the third general store, fumbling to place a few small bills on the counter to buy a bottle of water, the cashier, a thin teenager, silently pushed the money back toward him with a fingertip, not even bothering to look up, as if one more second of contact would be a personal insult. Jason picked up the money and left without the water, every step draining the last of his strength. The entire town had passed sentence on him. No charges read, no police cuffs, no courtroom rulings, only silence. A thick silence that killed his pride centimeter by centimeter. The houses lining Main Street closed their doors one after another, curtains falling limp to hide the cold eyes that followed his every guilty step. The clinking sound of locks turning echoed through the gray afternoon, each click hammering into his chest, pushing him lower into the pit of humiliation. Jason collapsed before the door of his home, a small wooden house on the town's edge, where weeds had started to creep up the steps and the paint peeled away in ragged patches. Pain shot up his spine as his knees slammed onto the frozen ground. An old neighbor, watering plants behind a rickety fence, glanced at him indifferently before turning away, the hose still running, treating Jason's collapse as meaningless as a puddle of stagnant water. No one helped him up. No one offered a word. A gaunt, stray dog passed by, paused to look at Jason, then turned away, as if even animals could smell the failure leaking from his skin. Jason crawled into his house, the door slamming behind him like a final punctuation mark, like the hammering shut of a coffin lid. Dust coated the door handle thickly, remnants of the days when he had strutted through with arrogance, now reduced to the faint traces of a man no one bothered to remember. He collapsed against the peeling wall, his heavy breathing rasping through the empty house like the last gasps of a man about to be erased. Elmridge had chosen its method of execution, not by guns, not by whips. When Jason dragged himself through the shabby living room, the dim light filtering through the dusty windows slanted across an old photograph hanging crookedly on the wall, the image of him in uniform, clasping the mayor's hand on the day he received a Medal of Honor. Now the frame hung askew, the glass dulled with mold and grime, his face in the photo blurred like a ghost's, unrecognizable. They erased Jason Kruger not with violence, but by simply wiping his name from everyday life. A flyer drifted through the door crack, advertising a new community event, an event where Jason would once have been an honored guest, but now his name did not appear, not a single footnote, not a whisper of invitation. Outside, children rode their bicycles past, laughter rising, then cutting off sharply as they passed the decaying house, as if even joy knew to steer clear of the land of disgrace. They let him live, but live as a ghost, rejected by the entire world, forgotten, not by the fading of memory, but by a cold contempt so complete it needed no words. Alexander McCall turned away from the square's edge, his steps slow but resolute, never looking back, because he knew it was not his hand that struck the final blow. It was not he who ended Jason. Jason, and the sins he had committed, had dug his own grave through the silent but irrevocable contempt of a community he had once scorned. As the darkness slowly receded from Elmridge and the biting early winter winds withdrew behind the dilapidated rooftops, the town's atmosphere did not grow any warmer. The event of Jason Kruger's ostracization, like a slow-moving death sentence, still lingered in every gaze, every cautious step across intersections, every isolated whisper in the town's worn-out cafe. The people of Elmridge did not speak of it, but everyone knew. The name Jason had officially become a symbol of irredeemable disgrace. Meanwhile, the name Robert McCall, the quiet veteran, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, as if the town needed to redeem itself from the shadow it had created. A hastily arranged ceremony of honor was put together by the town's officials. Invitations were sent out with flowery language about gratitude, about honoring the silent heroes, about efforts to rebuild trust within the community. But all of it was nothing more than hastily patched words, a thin veil to cover the town's belated shame. The banners, rushed through printing, still bore deep fold lines, draped awkwardly across the cold hall. The bouquets of plastic flowers filled the air with the cheap stench of plastic, overpowering the musty scent of a long, neglected room. No one in the town hall truly understood Robert McCall. To them, he was merely a link to be repaired in the public's eyes, a name onto which they could pin a medal to mend the cracks that could never truly be sealed within the heart of the town. They thought a certificate of merit, a gathering with a few dozen perfunctory applauses, and a clumsily written speech from a junior administrative assistant would be enough to soothe the deeply rooted disgrace staining Elmridge's soul. They were wrong, utterly wrong. When the mailman knocked on the door of the old wooden house where Robert lived, the light spilling from the window barely illuminated his silhouette by the old bookshelf, beside a faded American flag hanging crookedly on the wall. A stray cat curled up under the steps, and the wind whistled mournfully across the porch, like the tired groans of a house protesting the shamelessness knocking at its door. The mailman, a very young boy, face still tender and unsure, swimming in a jacket too large as if borrowed from an older brother, awkwardly held out a glaring red envelope toward Robert, his eyes filled with a mixture of expectation and a vague, instinctive fear. In the distance, the small postal truck idled with its engine running, the driver inside casting quick glances toward the house as if hoping the boy would deliver the envelope quickly so they could speed away. Robert did not rush to open it. He merely looked at the boy, his deep-set eyes hollowed by countless seasons of falling leaves, by too many times when trust had been shredded. A cold gust slipped through the cracked door, lifting the corner of the old flag to reveal the frayed threads dangling, like wounded flesh from a time when ideals still held weight. The boy stood frozen, clutching the strap of his messenger bag, his young face betraying a flicker of embarrassment mixed with awkward shame, as if he, too, understood that what he was delivering was not gratitude but a packaged insult wrapped in the veneer of belated appreciation. In that moment, a crow descended from nowhere, perched on the sagging power line above the roof, and let out a hoarse, grating cry like a funeral bell echoing through the gray afternoon. Robert spoke softly. "Thank you. You can go now." When the door closed, Robert remained standing there, the red envelope lying untouched on the scratched wooden table. No need to open it. No need to read it. He already knew what it contained, just as he knew that the belated apology, the hollow praises, were never truly meant for men like him. They were meant for the image that people needed to construct to save themselves from their own guilt. The next day, at the mayor's office, where the ceremony was planned to be held, everything was ready. Local reporters had microphones clipped and waiting, rows of plastic chairs lined up neatly, and a large banner stretched across the hall, boldly declaring, "Honoring the hero of Elmridge." The mayor, a small man with a frozen, plaster-like smile, fussed with his shirt collar, glancing nervously at his watch. Alexander McCall stood in the back, arms crossed, his eyes sharp and cold, observing every clumsy bit of theater unfolding without saying a word. When the wall clock struck the scheduled hour, the main door opened, but it was not Robert McCall who entered. Instead, a middle-aged administrative assistant approached the podium, holding a small slip of paper. No one understood what was happening until the microphone crackled, and the man cleared his throat and began reading slowly. "Robert McCall respectfully thanks the government and people of Elmridge. However, he will not be attending today's honoring ceremony." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. The reporters scrambled, swiveling their cameras around the hall. The mayor stepped forward awkwardly, but the assistant continued reading with cold detachment. Reason for declining: "I did not fight to be praised. I fought so that my children would not be slaves to titles." The words fell into the room like a bolt of lightning, shredding the false atmosphere. Every whisper was snuffed out instantly. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the hall, because in those simple words lay a total rejection, not just of the ceremony, but of all the staged theatrics Elmridge had tried to orchestrate to cover its irreparable stains. Alexander tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curving into an almost invisible smile. He understood. No one could confer honor upon Robert McCall, because he had never fought for it. He fought for the truth, for freedom, for things no gilded certificate could ever represent. Outside the hall, the wind swept fiercely again through Elmridge's narrow alleys. The faded American flag outside Robert's home fluttered in the wind, not needing an audience, not needing praise, because there are some lives, some souls, that by merely standing steadfast in silence are honored beyond anything any broken or repentant system could ever bestow. And the ceremony that day, the one prepared with all its speeches, banners, flowers, and empty adulation, ended quietly in the hollow gazes of those in attendance. Like cold ashes scattering over frozen ground, no one dared speak of it again. No one dared ask why, because the answer had already been etched perfectly into those 7 unbendable words. I fought so that my children would not be slaves to titles. When the hollow praises dissipated into the cold void of Elmridge, when the banner of honor and the bouquet of plastic flowers were flipped and scattered by the wind outside the town hall, the town reverted to the worn-out facade it had always tried to conceal beneath layers of garish paint, a small, arrogant place riddled with the spreading cracks of counterfeit pride. The ceremony honoring Robert McCall ended in quiet, humiliating failure, and Robert, like an ancient stream, simply withdrew to his faded wooden house, needing no fanfare, no flashes, no shaky handshakes born out of guilty trembling. News of the event quickly spread beyond the narrow borders of Elmridge. Local news stations, hot topic bloggers, and scavengers hungry for lone hero stories came flooding in. Black SUVs, telescopic lenses, microphones thrust into faces, all descended like an artificial flood onto Robert's porch. But there, the old wooden door remained firmly shut, leaving only a weathered sign, its ink nearly erased. No visitors. Alexander McCall, clad in a faded khaki jacket, leaned against the porch railing, observing the crowd as one might watch a ridiculous carnival. His face betrayed no emotion, his gaze colder than the wind, tilting the flimsy signs reading, "We appreciate our heroes." He knew they had not come for his father. They came for photographs, for sensational headlines, for a historic handshake they could flaunt to the public until it had been chewed down to its last ounce of commercial value. And that was why Alexander refused everything, every interview request, every offer for airtime, every desperate phone call, begging to hear the touching story of the McCall family. He rejected them with a cold, clean finality, like slicing through silk with a frozen blade, leaving no room for retreat, no need for explanation. Not because he disdained sharing, but because he understood there are battles, there are victories, that if they must rely on a camera flash to be recognized, they lose all meaning the moment they begin. Alexander simply disappeared from the lenses. He spent all his remaining time with Robert, over bitter black coffee on the creaking porch in the mornings, in silent afternoons listening to the wind caress the weathered walls, in the long nights accompanied only by the buzz of insects and a handful of memories that needed no words to be remembered. Some days, Alexander and Robert did not exchange a single word. They simply sat, father and son, 2 silent generations standing guard for each other in a world drowning in noise. And within that seemingly barren silence there existed a bond stronger than any speech, any award, any medal, an understanding that needed no explaining, a pride that needed no praise, and above all, a freedom absolute, freedom from the yoke of titles the outside world tried so hard to force onto the necks of those who had bled, who had sweated, who had poured their very souls into simple, unadorned ideals. One evening, as the sun dipped into a tarnished shade like the old flag's fading colors, Alexander spoke softly, without looking over. "Dad, they should have put up a statue of you in the middle of town." Robert did not smile. He merely raised his head, his eyes, once gazing straight into war, into death, into betrayal by his own kind, now softened into the quiet glow of a man who had seen everything and endured it. And he replied, his voice rough, each word falling with the weight of stone, "I fought so that my children would not be slaves to titles." Alexander gently tightened his calloused hands resting on his knees, the rough skin trembling slightly. He said nothing more, for in that moment, any words would have been excess, dwarfed by a single answer that defined the entirety of a life. From that day on, Robert McCall's gate remained firmly closed. No one, not even the largest television networks, could breach that silence. One by one, the reporters withdrew in disappointment. The hero who did not want fame story grew stale and faded from the headline. But for Elmridge, and for anyone who had witnessed the collapse of an entire system before the unwavering will of an old veteran and a Delta Force commander, the name McCall remained carved into the town's history like a blade cut deep, needing no applause, needing no tribute, needing no flashes, only needing to exist, and to exist through the stubborn silence that would not yield. When winter began to sweep its skin-cutting winds across Elmridge, Alexander still sat beside his father every night, without plans, without spectators, quietly sharing a space, a moment in time, like men who once knew that the greatest battles are often the ones no one ever talks about. Enter draped Elmridge in thin veils of mist, like an ancient spider web, wrapping itself around every street corner, every faded porch, every rusted sign that had endured too many seasons of cutting winds. Yet amid that silent cold, there existed an echo, something unseen and tangible, quietly weaving through alleys, classrooms, and muted afternoons in the town's dusty cafes. The story of Robert McCall. It needed no telling, no spreading. It flowed on its own, like the quiet warmth from a bed of coals, warming hearts long frozen by the betrayal and deceit that had once permeated this town. At first, it was just whispers. An old woman selling pastries at the market's corner quietly told her young grandchild about the dark-skinned man sitting silently on the porch of a weathered wooden house, about how he had salvaged the dignity of an entire community simply by refusing the belated applause. An aging bus driver, halting at a red light on Main Street, found himself recounting to the child in the back seat the tale of a veteran who taught the whole town a lesson in humility, not through speeches, but through the steady presence of a man who needed no noise. And so, like hidden currents beneath a frozen lake, the resonance of Robert McCall spread quietly, more powerfully than any media campaign the officials had ever imagined. Then, one morning, at Elmridge Elementary School, it all blossomed. There were no official announcements, no banners hung at the gate, no teacher stood to deliver moral lessons or read a scripted lecture about gratitude. It was just the children, in their purest innocence, who began to draw. On torn-out pages from their notebooks, with clumsy, colored pencils, they sketched a man sitting on an old porch, a faded American flag fluttering behind him. Some drawings showed a wooden gate half closed, with a faint silhouette behind a worn curtain. Others simply depicted rough hands clasping a weathered badge, without names, without frames. No one told them to do it, no one taught them to call it honoring. They simply drew. And each drawing, each clumsy line, each innocent color was a quiet but resolute knock on the hardened doors of grown-up hearts. Hearts that had once believed gratitude had to be planned, staged, recorded, and broadcast during prime time. Word of the drawings quickly spilled beyond the school gates. Small shops began asking permission to display them in glass cases at their entrances. A few cafe owners printed them as posters and hung them behind their counters, not with banners or flashy slogans, but quietly, allowing those who stepped inside to pause and glimpse something no words could adequately convey. Even the old gas station at the town's edge, once considered a haven for drifters, pinned one drawing silently onto its notice board, beside faded classifieds and unsold lottery tickets. No calls for fundraising were made, no grand speeches were delivered, there was only silence. And within that silence, Robert McCall became something no ceremony could fabricate, a true symbol, not through gold and silver, not through declarations, but through an enduring, quiet existence that could never be bought or sold. Alexander McCall crossed the town square on a gray afternoon, his military boots striking slow, deliberate steps against the cold cement. He paused outside a small bookstore, where a child just learning to read was struggling to sound out words in front of a drawing of a dark-skinned man sitting under a silent sunset. The shop owner, an elderly woman with silver hair, caught his eye and simply nodded, a nod heavier than 1,000 cumbersome thank yous. Alexander bowed his head slightly in return, then continued walking, letting the cold winter wind and street dust gnaw at his heels. He knew Robert did not need to see those drawings, did not need anyone to recount them, did not need to know. For men like Robert McCall, the value of their lives did not lie in what was recognized, but in what was silently passed along, even without being named. That evening, as Alexander sat with Robert on the old porch, neither mentioned the drawings, neither spoke of how far the story had spread. Only the wind whispered across the eaves, and the wood creaked under the weight of two men who had fought their greatest battles, not with bullets, not with swords, but through unwavering silence. Outside, beneath the black sky of Elmridge, the drawings continued drifting from shop to street corner, from the tiny school to the old gas station, like vivid fragments of memory that needed no teaching, no prompting, no enforcement. And within that quiet persistence, Robert Macaulay, the man who had refused every title, every ceremony, every spotlight, became an indelible part of the town's soul, needing no monument, no gilded plaque, only to be remembered in the most natural and unpretentious way possible. As the simple yet sincere drawings continued to weave their way through every narrow alley, every old window frame of Elmridge, as the name Robert McCall was whispered like a reminder no one needed to memorize, the chilling early spring winds still refused to leave this land long accustomed to winters that dragged on longer than necessary. The town fell into an eerie silence, as if it too was bowing before an undeniable truth, that there are those who by refusing all glorification carve their names into history in a way no one could ever erase. On the faded wooden porch at the end of Main Street, Robert McCall still sat there, as he had every afternoon since the winds had changed. No one dared approach. No one dared disturb him. They all understood. Some moments are meant to remain untouched, like rough but enduring carvings in stone, needing no embellishment, no polish. Robert sat on the old wooden chair, his back straight, his gaze stretching out toward the horizon where the skeletal trees braced against the cold wind. His right hand clutched a small object, a weathered badge, its metal rim scratched and worn through the years, its silver sheen faded under the tarnished light of the afternoon sun, yet in Robert's calloused palm it still glowed with an undying light. It was not the light of glory, not of victory. It was the light of vows kept in full, needing no recognition, needing no praise. Alexander McCall leaned silently against a porch column, watching his father. He said nothing. He knew that in this moment, any word would be a desecration. His presence alone, quiet yet steadfast, spoke everything that words could not. Robert needed no thanks, no grand speeches, no flashbulbs shining onto a face weathered by time. He simply needed to sit there, amidst the gray chill of Elmridge, gripping that badge as a lone sentinel guarding a world that had forgotten how to honor resilience. Outside, children ran laughing down the streets, clutching the drawings they had made. Shopkeepers hung new modest signs above their doors, "Live like McCall." No one instructed them, no one demanded it. It all unfolded naturally, like small waves, tirelessly wearing down even the hardest stones. The afternoon sun slid lower across the porch steps, casting long, broken streaks across the weathered wood. Robert remained motionless, as if even time itself hesitated to push him forward. The badge rested in his hand, cold but weighty with every battle he had fought, bloody battles, shadowed battles, battles without names or medals. Yet, perhaps, the greatest battle of his life was not fought on a battlefield, But here, in a small town that once chose to turn its back on dignity and then slowly found its way back through the steadfast silence of a man who refused to become a hero by the world's. The cold wind stirred, making the faded American flag above the porch flutter weakly. Robert gently squeezed the badge, his eyes closing for a long, silent moment. Not from exhaustion, not from regret, but because he was remembering comrades who never returned, whispered vows made in muddy trenches, the trust passed once through a single glance, now lost forever, and in all those memories not once did he fight for applause. He fought to prove that there are values which cannot be sold, cannot be bargained away, and must never be forgotten. When Robert opened his eyes, the sun was nearly kissing the distant mountains. A blurred halo of light dyed the horizon, blood red against the cold stone. He tightened his hold on the badge one last time, then rested it on his knee, his gaze heavy, as if speaking to a world too noisy to hear anything true. And in that almost frozen moment, amid the biting wind and the dying light, between the blood-soaked past and the heavy present, a silent vow rang out, not spoken aloud, not written in ink, but inscribed through Robert McCall's very existence. There are battles where standing firm is enough to make others tremble. Every life, no matter how grand or how quiet, has chapters that may never be fully told. The story you have just heard is not merely about justice, betrayal, or forgiveness. It is about how each of us, in our small and fragile ways, chooses to face pain, mistakes, and the flickering hopes that still survive in our hearts. If you have ever lived through a moment like that, where someone's silence nearly broke you, or where a small act of kindness helped save a crumbling faith, please share your story with us in the comments below, because maybe, just maybe, your story could be the small light that guides someone else who has lost their way. If you find meaning in what we strive to share, if you wish to help us spread more of these honest and stirring stories, do not hesitate to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to our channel. It is not merely encouragement. It is the strength that allows us to continue bringing you stories that are real, raw, and deeply human. Thank you for listening with your whole heart.